Welcome back. Hopefully everyone had a chance to get a little more coffee, take a break. That was an exceptional 2.5 hours. I think it takes all of us an enormous amount of time to digest that wonderful and rich discussion. But we're going to keep the ball rolling because our second panel, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, is putting ourselves again in historical context. As one of the founders of the West and the U.S. Containment strategy was born from George Kennan's long telegram. And I should have made it mandatory reading prior to this discussion, but I encourage you, if you have some free time this weekend, pull that off the internet and read the long telegram. In fact, read the Mr. X article and the sources of Soviet conduct from Foreign Affairs. I think you'll find it a very rich document. But I was struck in George Kennan. I'm just going to read the very beginning of the cable. He was responding to a request from the State Department to sort of give a holistic picture of what was going on. And George Kennan said that the department's questions were so intricate, so delicate, so strange to our form of thought, and so important to analysis of our international environment that I cannot compress answers into a single brief message without yielding to what I feel would be a dangerous degree of oversimplification. Well, I'm asking our panelists to condense this in about 8 to 10 minutes. So I think you would probably feel George Kennan's anguish of having to compress so much complexity into so brief a presentation. But George Kennan, how he approached his topic was in fact to break it down into 5 manageable bites. So he broke down his answer in the long telegram into the basic features of post-war Soviet outlook, the background of this outlook, its projections and practical policy on an official level. Its fourth element was its projection on an unofficial level. And finally, its practical deductions from standpoint of U.S. policy. So he begins, of course, with, Kennan underlines that the Soviet Union still lives in an antagonistic capitalist encirclement with which, in the long run, there can be no permanent peaceful coexistence. And 2 other thoughts I will give you. Mr. Kennan states that everything must be done to advance the relative strength of the Soviet Union as a factor in international society. He suggests at the time that Soviet efforts must be directed toward deepening and exploiting the difference in conflicts between capitalist powers. I think we heard some refrains of that in our last session. And finally, he suggests that the democratic progressive elements abroad are to be utilized to maximize and bring pressure to bear on capitalist governments along lines agreeable to Soviet interests. So Mr. Kennan gave us some good food for thought, and we've asked 3 fantastic panelists to give us their reflections on what the 21st century policy vision should be for Western or U.S. policy towards the Russian Federation. Beginning, we have with us, and my gratitude to the German Marshall Fund's Transatlantic Academy that's bringing both Uli and Merrick here to Washington for several months. But let me begin with Dr. Ulrich Speck, a senior fellow at the Transatlantic Academy. And prior to this, Dr. Speck was a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe, and I'm an avid reader of Uli's work from Carnegie Europe. He's also served in Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty in both in Prague and in Brussels. And he's actually been in Washington before as serving as a fellow at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies. Uli has also served as the editor of the Global Europe Brief and a journalist by background. So, Dr. Speck, we look forward to your reflections. After Dr. Speck provides his comments, we're going to turn to Olga Oliker, who I am absolutely delighted to welcome as the new senior advisor and director of the CSIS Russia and Eurasia program. We are delighted that Olia is here with us. Prior to her arrival at CSIS, Olia occupied many senior positions at the RAND Corporation, including the director of the Center for Russia and Eurasia at RAND. She has also served some time sounds like a prison term. She's, I don't mean to suggest that, served in the Defense Department from 1994 to 1996. One of her recent reports, which I think is very appropriate, Russian Foreign Policy in Historical and Current Context, a reassessment that was released in 2015. So perfectly suited, and we are so delighted, Olia, that you were both here at CSIS and you are speaking on the panel. And finally, we're delighted to have Marek Menkiszak, who is the head of the Russian department at the Center for European Studies based in Warsaw, but he is also here as a fellow at the Transatlantic Academy. Merrick has had a distinguished career. He has also been a visiting researcher at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. He has served on an EU-Russia task force at the EU Institute for Security Studies in Paris, and certainly, as his many titles suggest, he has focused on Russia's foreign and security policy and its intersection with Europe's security strategies for many years. So we've got a great lineup, but with a daunting task, I readily admit. So with that, Uli, I'll turn to you, and we'll just go down the line, and you can impart your wisdom. What would Mr. Kennan say? Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for having me here. What would he say? I don't know. I have no idea. I also think we cannot just copy and paste the long telegram, which is terrific, mainly because Russia is not the Soviet Union. And today is a different time and a different challenge. The end of communism, I think has changed the nature of the Russian challenge. There's no clear ideology anymore. There's little soft power. If you read the long telegram, you really feel this sense of that there's a system. It's a coherent ideology which is attractive to many in the West. So all this has more or less disappeared, more or less. And secondly, we live in a globalized world, and Russia is much more dependent on the West. And this is an interdependent world with open borders, which the Russians very much appreciate, at least those who matter in the system. So autarky, really, stopping any contact with the West is just not an option for the system. And the system is unstable. It's moving. It's searching its direction. So in my remarks, I would like to try to talk in the spirit of Kennan, which is the feet are quite large and big. So, but I would like to give my views of what I think the challenge is and of what we could perhaps do to address this challenge. So why is Russia aggressive? Why is it a spoiler? Why is it not cooperative? Why is it not immersing itself into the globalized world like Japan, France, or Britain, or other empires or countries of its size and economic powers are doing? So I think there are two issues, and one is regime survival, and the other is the idea of Russia as being a great power on the level of the US and perhaps China. Both are, I think, two sides of the same coin. Both are about regime survival. This is a very defensive regime, trying aggression as defense. I'm going to speak about the ambition of being a global power. I think the Putin regime needs a narrative of success. There's not much going on at home in terms of nation building. And we just saw it worked. Crimea, it resonates in Russia. It's not by accident that Putin is choosing this type of ideological narrative. It's because it reflects frustrations in Russia among the middle class about what is basically the loss of empire. So we have seen Putin working out a foreign policy program based on this ambition. I would say there are three basic elements. One is to rebuild or to keep a sphere of control, not a sphere of influence, a sphere of control, like the Warsaw Pact, in its immediate neighborhood until the NATO border, as far as they can go. And then secondly, a sphere of influence, which is the EU, trying to undermine the EU as a coherent actor. And we see also in the Middle East reclaiming positions they had, the Soviet Union had before. And on a global level, Russia wants to have a veto over everything, basically. I mean, something I think is also very interesting to see what the Russian interpretation of the UN system is. And it's much more traditional global power. It's the veto powers who run the world. And there's not much of sovereign equality of nations in their understanding of the UN. So this is the program, and I think we have to work with this program. We can always analyze or think about why the system is using this kind of narratives, policies. But this is what we are confronted with. This is coupled with an agenda of regime survival in more concrete terms. It's pushing back against liberal democracy, because liberal democracy is advancing. It advanced in Kiev, all the colored revolutions in the post-Soviet sphere, and then it came even back home to Moscow. So liberal democracy is what really threatens the regime. So again, instead of just fighting it at home, they also fight it outside. I see the Syria adventure as an attempt to re-legitimize autocracy, or to legitimize autocratic regimes as legitimate powers, which pushing back against what globalization brought, end of history, the victory of liberal democracy, this third wave. So it's not just about Syria, about assets on the ground. It's also about fighting back against regime change, Libya, Gaddafi. And he wants to Putin wants basically to keep his client in power, also show what the Russians can do, that they are really able to build a system around autocratic legitimacy. So what can we do? There is no silver bullet, as Timothy Snyder has said, and I agree with him that this is a long-term challenge. It won't disappear. It's an illusion to think that with a grand bargain we could end the challenge that we are posing for Putin, because it's not so much about what we are doing, it's about what we are. It's about our system of governance that is threatening his hold on power. So I don't think it can be easily solved, because we cannot promise Russia what he wants, Putin what he wants, which is stability, regime survival, and a guarantee that in the space between Russia and the West, no colored revolution will occur. So I think we had what we saw in the Ukraine conflict or war can really serve as a model. I think the West has achieved a lot. So, and the response that we found is made of 4 elements. One is deterrence on the military level, NATO, credibility of collective defense. Not everybody believes it, but I think there's, with this persistent stationing, so on, I think there's a level of credibility that is quite good, and the Warsaw Summit will add to that. Secondly, sanctions. I think this is really, sanctions is also hard power, it's not just soft power. It's about really trying to force the opponent to change his behavior. Did we succeed? I think to a certain extent, yes, but it, of course, depends on a counterfactual narrative. What would have happened without the sanctions? Would Putin have entered Ukraine with regular troops, have built a land bridge, so on? But it didn't happen, and it seems that sanctions played a role, also by signaling to Moscow that the West is actually united, and the EU can have a joint policy, which is tough and which puts cost also on the domestic business. So I think this was a big surprise, and it also signaled to Russia that it cannot just advance as far as they want. Third element, support for Ukraine, support for the neighborhood. Fourth element, the diplomatic process to reach out to Russia and always try, and the Germans are very good at that, keep the channels open, keep communication open. If one diplomatic meeting fails, just schedule the next one. But this was, I think, also an important part of where we've arrived now. We have a diplomatic process. And I think in general, providing Russia with an opportunity to so-called off-ramp to change behavior and come back into a more in a different kind of interaction with the West is important. On a broader level, I think we need to understand that we cannot escape this challenge, that we have to live with a more antagonistic relationship with Russia, which is hard for many people, it's hard to live with, especially those who have lived through the Cold War in Europe. And Russia actually is a threat. It has nuclear weapons, and there's no speech of Putin where he doesn't talk about nuclear weapons. So, but I think Europe has to live with that. That's a challenge for Europe to learn to live with an antagonistic relationship with Russia. On the other hand, we should not overestimate Russia. Russia is weak. This is an asymmetric conflict. To me, Russia often behaves like a guerrilla power, hiding in the dark, doing things that you cannot see, and then they have always this kind of denial. So it's not that they go, confront us directly. So there is a weak hand. Ambitions are not matched by means. The economy is weak. The dream of being a power on the level of the US is just hollow. It's based on not much. It's based basically on parity on nuclear weapons. But there's no chance for Russia to shape its neighborhood, its environment, because of economic weakness and because it's just alone. This is also an aspect when we talk about Russia as a great power. Great powers in the 19th century, what has defined a great power in the 19th century? Economic strength first, and then alliances, friends. Russia in the 19th century was bound into alliances, the Holy Alliance, also an anti-revolutionary alliance, by the way, as we see it today, but today it's alone. China doesn't want really to be in that with Russia, and even, in Georgia we saw it already, the non-recognition of Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Eurasian Union is not really working. It's not an alliance. It's okay. So I think we need to balance between living with this relationship and not going back to some kind of Cold War, because this is not the case. On a broader level, I think we need some kind of renaissance of the West. I did a paper last year with Roland Freudenstein from Martin Center in Brussels. We need to commit to our values, and we need to be clear about what we want. And here I end with quoting Kennan. Gorged against the Western world as a whole, Soviets are still by far the weaker force. Their success will really depend on the degree of cohesion. Our success will really depend on the degree of cohesion, firmness, and vigor which Western world can muster. And this is a factor which is within our power to influence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oli. A lot of good food for thought there, and I look forward to bringing in some of the questions. Olia, please.
All right, can you hear me? Okay, so I'm going to start by saying that this is the funnest speaking assignment I've gotten in years. I think it's a great question. I also think what's an interesting thing to consider is that there's a difference in asking what Kennan's long telegram would look like now if Kennan wrote it versus asking what it would look like if I wrote it. You know, where you stand depends not only on where you sit, but also where you come from. And Kennan was an American white man, Ivy League educated, politically and socially conservative, longtime student of Russian history and politics. He designed containment and then tried to walk back from it, being particularly unhappy with the militarization of US policy towards Russia after a few years. And when he wrote the long telegram in 1946, he was the US DCM in Moscow. So like Kennan, I'm white, American, and overeducated, though I'm not sure Kennan would have agreed with the first of those, because if you read his personal writings, which have come out recently, there's a lot of racism, including anti-Semitism, in there. So what Kennan thought was white might not be what some of us think is white. The fact that I think these things are important and notable and worth mentioning probably tip you off that I'm not much of a conservative by most metrics. But like Kennan, I've spent most of my life studying Russia. I'm not in Russia now. I haven't been there since May. But I also have a benefit Kennan didn't have, which is that unlike in 1946, I have access to a virtual Russia. I have Twitter, I have LiveJournal, I have Kontakte, and I have a lot of news sources all saying a lot of very different things, which can give me an impression of what people think in Russia, what's going on in Russia, which I wouldn't have had sitting in Washington in 1946. So Kennan's long telegram was about US relations with Russia. That's pretty much what I'm going to talk about too. I'm actually going to follow it because I thought this was just a really neat exercise to do, both for what it says about what policy ought to be, because I think it's a great format that he developed, and also because it points up the contrasts. As Dr. Speck noted, Russia is not the Soviet Union. So, as Heather said, Kennan first wrote about how the USSR saw the world. As its own propaganda described the world, right? Which is, we are a socialist bulwark encircled by capitalist enemies, locked in ideological conflict with them for world domination. The capitalists are going to keep fighting one another, which is great. That should be encouraged. That is how we're going to strengthen socialism. Okay, that's an ideology, right? What's Russia today? So Russia today feels kind of under siege. Sort of surrounded by enemies, but not quite, right? I mean, China is kind of a frenemy more than an enemy. It's really surrounded on the western flank, which isn't surrounded. Russia, as Dr. Speck pointed out, it's all about retaking its rightful, historically rooted global role as a great power. And the United States has nefariously spent the last 20 plus years trying to weaken and undermine post-Soviet Russia, abetted by allies and puppets, and undermining global stability. But you know, the undermining global stability is secondary, right? It's really about weakening Russia. So this isn't a war of ideologies per se. It's this need to challenge US expansionism and hegemony, which Russia thinks it's in a position to do. And the most important thing to get there is to get more influence around the world, and that is a parallel to 1946. But it's not this locked-in conflict model that Kennan saw then. Rather, there's this mixed attitude that it is possible to work with the US, that Russia being on the world stage, it's about challenging US hegemony, but it's also about working with the United States and being on par with them. And then the last thing I'd note that Kennan doesn't, though he saw it too, is the importance of a very centralized system with one person at that center. Kennan mentions Stalin here and there, but he doesn't dwell on it. But what I think is interesting about that is the unpredictability it brings to behavior. One of the things we learned watching the Soviet Union over decades is that as it did go through transitions of power, it became a very conservative state, which you don't have when you've got one person who listens to very few people, who gets very limited information and makes decisions which might then be a little whimsical. So when Kennan talked about what was behind the Soviet Union he saw, he concluded on the one hand that Russians aren't really like this, and on the other hand that the Russian view was empirically wrong. He then walked back the first point because he argued that the viewpoint he presented was an elite view, but reflective of a traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. That's my first Kennan quote, which I think is a good one, but it also says that actually they are like this. That is something he saw as inherently Russian. He also noted that the encirclement hypothesis, while inaccurate, was believed by some, and he also noted, and I think this is a fantastic one for today, is that Russians aren't big believers in objective truth. They see most narratives as instrumentalist. Now, whether or not that was true then, today, wow, right? I mean, the entire panel we heard this morning is all about instrumentalist narratives, though I would argue that these days, the Russians are not the only ones guilty of this, and it is in fact difficult to find narratives that aren't a little bit instrumentalist in the political space. So also, as then, the Russian assessment of the situation is flawed. But it also, as then, has elements of truth, right? US actions over the last 15 years or so have not exactly been those of a status quo state bent on stability. It's just that it wasn't about Russia in particular. But here, I think the question of centralized rule is very important and something we really need to understand when we think about what's behind Russian policy. And it's this deep fear of the people at that center of instability, but as Dr. Speck pointed out, instability defined as losing power, right? The scariest thing is instability that might take me out of my centralized role here. So third, how does this manifest in policy, official policy? So Kennan said that at home, the Soviets would be trying to build up strength and prestige. They'd work with other countries, international organizations to weaken Western influence abroad. That Russia would compete with the West for influence over less developed countries, colonial eras and areas and backward or dependent people, which kind of goes back to that racist tendency. But the point being to work with these little minor peoples to weaken the West. So today, okay, great power role, influence, challenging the US. I'd say roughly in that order. I'd say that kind of influence and challenging the US are ways of strengthening the great power role. So what would I expect Russia to do coming out of that? I'd expect Russia to be pretty insistent on asserting power where it really is confident it's supposed to have a say, and to be opportunistic in standing up to the US in most other areas. You could say this is all built on hindsight for the last 2 years, which it kind of is, but I also think it does fit with the model. I also think we can expect a lot of rhetoric, which sometimes overshoots the realities of what Russia actually can or intends to do, which has been a hallmark of Russian foreign policy rhetoric for the last 20 years and is incredibly frustrating, but it's not going away. Fourth, unofficial policy or deniable actions. In 1946, this was about Russian support for communist parties abroad, efforts to influence social groups, infiltrate organizations. Today, right, everyone's talking about what I call the H word, because I don't like it because it has another meaning in military analysis, but it's this idea that there is a big propaganda campaign on, that there's this whole use of national power. But the choir now, it isn't communist. The people that the Russians are preaching to, it's discontents, it's an effort to just raise doubts, which means that unlike under communism, there's no positive message here. There's just a negative message. It's just about questions. So in pursuit of that agenda, that negative agenda, we can expect them to support and perhaps even develop groups and organizations in other states who might be sympathetic to Russia. But as we've seen in Europe, there isn't an ideological logic to it, right? It's groups on the left, it's groups on the right, it's anybody who can subvert the order. We saw it work in Crimea. We saw it have limited success in East Ukraine. We saw it fail definitively in the rest of Ukraine, and now we see bits and pieces of it elsewhere. It bears watching, but I don't think it's working. Fifth and finally, what does all of this mean for US policy? Kennan saw the Soviet Union as committed to the impossibility of a modus vivendi with the US. He also said that, I think this is my last quote, and I think this is a great one, Soviet power is impervious to the logic of reason, but it is highly sensitive to the logic of force. The first follows from his earlier arguments. It's not entirely clear to me why he came up with the second. particularly because in later years he became very frustrated by the militarization of the policy. He pointed out also, and as we have, that they're weaker, and they're going to stay weaker as long as the West stays united, that a lot of their philosophy was based on the idea that we would divide early and often. He noted that the lies of Soviet propaganda can be combated with truth, and that the best defense was the success of Western society. As his later writing showed, he thought the solution was spheres of influence and political ideological battles. He thought that you could win this in a non-militarized way, which isn't entirely clear when you read this stuff in the first place. And the folks who followed him, who he ended up falling out with, saw it as very much about, well, force. But as it turned out, he didn't. In fact, Vladimir Putin would probably be comfortable with some of what George Kennan, as it turned out, thought was the right way forward. Today, I don't think Russia, I disagree a little bit. I don't think it's who we are that threatens them unless they think it's coming for them, right? They think you can live alongside the West as it is, as long as the West keeps to its pieces and leave the rest to Russia. I do tend to share Kennan's aversion to too much militarization. They're certainly weaker, militarily and economically. Their propaganda is harder to combat with truth because it's really become much more difficult to demonstrate monopoly on truth, and too many people try to demonstrate a monopoly on truth by lying. So, we don't have that credibility that we had in those days. Finally, and most importantly, Kennan saw a world where the USSR was focused on the United States and, really importantly, vice versa. That is not today's world. Where the US is certainly central to Russian foreign policy, Russia is just one of many issues for the United States, and it's not the most important. US foreign policy will categorically not be built on a Russian threat. So what does that mean for that foreign policy? What does that mean for that policy to Russia? I'd argue that what we see in Russia today calls for hedging, not containment, and I agree with everybody else who said that this is a long-term game. Russia wants to rewrite the post-Cold War settlement. It wants to claim a global role. Its leadership wants to stay in power. These things, in some ways, but not always, put it at odds with US interests. So the US and its allies have to be prepared to respond and to act preemptively in times and to prepare, very importantly, to prepare when response is needed. But we need to be very cautious of overestimating the threat, over-militarizing our response, and closing doors that might be better left open. Because if there's one thing the Cold War teaches us, is that it's not enough to signal. Your signals have to be understood. And it's really hard to understand each other through closed doors. I mean, if you look at this blip that we had recently with the slide of a torpedo that was leaked on purpose, this is the Russians signaling us they've got a pretty bad sense of how we respond. On the other hand, we have a pretty bad sense of how they respond most of the time, too. So, kind of the idea of dialogue, Polish-Russian dialogue, US-Russian dialogue, German-Russian dialogue, anything that helps us explicitly explain the signaling we're doing to each other sometimes and say, when we did this, we meant this, I think is going to be very important. Finally, I'm going to close by arguing that it's a good time for the United States to think through not just how we want to respond to Russia, but how we want to prioritize our interests around the world, which has, in turn, implications for the policy towards Russia. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Oh, that was fantastic. George Kennan would be impressed. Marek, over to you.
Thank you very much. Obviously, saying about the sources of Russian conduct in 10 minutes is simply impossible, which makes me quite relaxed. And obviously, it's a pick and choose then. And whatever you will say, you're going to say, obviously, you always greatly oversimplified things, which is obvious thing. So I would like to, what I'm going to do is to entertain you with a certain formula which underlines things which seem to me the most important from my personal opinion on these matters. So the formula goes, it's three double P's. So it's about perception, it's about power, and it's about policy. The first, perception. perception is paranoid. It's a very bad word, obviously. It's paranoid from our perspective. It's absolutely realistic from perspective of those people who believe in that. But the important thing is to stress that the world we see and the world these members of the narrow ruling elite, about a dozen or 20 people in Russia who really run the country, these are different worlds. These are simply different worlds. There is a US-led Western conspiracy against Russia. It's a long-term effort. You have to remember famous Brzezinski plan, which consisted of 3 parts. So encirclement of Russia, weakening Russia, and finally destroying Russia by cutting into several pieces geopolitical units. So it has old history, obviously. Obviously, United States have organized color revolutions and organized Arab Spring, by the way. That these events were absolutely not genuine social, spontaneous movements. These were special operations, simply as that, US-led special operations. And even the protests in Russia in December 2011 and further, these events were simply a failed attempt of coup d'etat made by the United States. I mean, this is the reality in what terms such people like Putin himself, like Patrushev, like Sergei Ivanov to a large extent also, and few others define their perceptions. So the claim is that there is an obvious aim of US policy, which is the regime change. And this policy is supported by various means. On a level of societies, so this is the penetration of societies by NGOs, by use of modern technologies, social networks, internet, which, as Putin said, was created by CIA, as developed as an instrument of US policy. And occasionally also supported by use of force. So these are 2 elements. So penetration within, internally, and external use of external force. In all to create this regime change policy. What stems in all from that is that in this kind of reality, the West, and especially the United States, are at war with Russia. There is a war ongoing. It's not war because U.S. has chosen to do that. It's the war because these people, that's my conviction, believe there is a reality of war. It does not mean that, of course, there is use of military force, but war is waged by very different means: economic, social, propaganda, whatever. And actually, that, of course, reveals a very deep sense of vulnerability. Because all this paranoid view actually leads to a conclusion that these people feel really endangered, personally. They feel vulnerable. And in their perception, what they do with all these aggressive policies, it's a peculiar form of self-defense. Another part, it's about power. So power in Russia is increasingly personalized. The system of power under Putin's rule have changed a lot over time. Early Putin in this first years of first term is a completely different Putin than now. Then there was Putin of the second term, which was also different. The Putin under Medvedev was different. And then now Putin under the third term is also different Putin, and it's a different system to some extent. This system is should no longer be described only as authoritarian. It is increasingly autocratic. It's dependent on a single person who is absolutely, he's a point of reference and he's ultimate decision maker. It does not mean that he's omnipotent. No, absolutely. He still relies on his collaborators, colleagues. He also are increasingly less effective in making the policy decisions. The very narrow, increasingly narrow ruling elite of Russia, which is dominated by people from the secret services. And actually this factor that they come from secret services like Putin strongly influence their perceptions of the world and their way to doing things. Also, what is important that they project their mentality, their way of thinking to the West. They believe the West is acting, creating all these conspiracies because they were told, that they were taught. That's their professional background. They know how to do that. They know how to manipulate. They know how to organize special operations, active measures. They simply, that's for them, that's a natural reality. And they are projecting this onto others and to opponent, to the West, to the United States especially. And these people, I mean, there is an increasingly narrow group, and there is increasingly closed process of decision-making. And in fact, there is a lack of trust within this group and within this, the broader elite. And there is a situation in which the people who belong to this elite, they are increasingly like lobbyists for Putin, for control, for share and power, for money, increasingly scarce resources, and they are fighting now increasingly over the scarce resources because of the bad economic situation. And there is a problem of lack of trust, and Putin tends to not have much trust. He tends to trust basically those people who share a certain peculiar worldview with him. And it creates a situation in which the only way actually to, not only to be uplifted within the Russian regime, but to retain its position is to actually provide Putin with what he wants to hear, replicate the same patterns, the same way of thinking. Otherwise, if you don't do that within the system, you're not trusted, and just you lose your influence, you lose your position eventually. So that creates a certain vicious circle in which there are narrow communication channels. Putin basically learns about the world from the reports of secret services, and those secret services know that he's not going to believe anything which does not actually increases its peculiar paranoid worldview. So if you would like theoretically try to convince Putin that he's wrong, that his policies is completely mess, and actually that what he believes is fantasy, you absolutely immediately will lose access to him and access to power and access to all benefits, great benefits which this power brings. So it makes the system working and increasingly radical because there is this vicious circle mechanism within the bureaucracy. The final part, that's about the policy. The policy is paradoxical. Maybe it's not a good word for that. I would say it's rather dialectical. So if you asked somebody, often there are questions whether there is a clear strategy of the Russian policy or it's purely opportunistic or it's pure tactics. My answer is it's both, simultaneously. The problem is that you have a very vague strategic goals, and there is an extremely long-term systemic approach to reaching these goals. So this policy, various tactics which are constantly changing actually serve these broad goals, strategic goals. But what is also part of this is extremely flexible tactics, it's constantly changing tactics, very responsive to the changing environment. And this enormous flexibility, tactical, sometimes absolutely making other actors really surprised, is actually one of the strengths, or at least one of the reasons why this still keeps going, despite huge weaknesses Russia has. And again, about weakness and strength, whether Russia acts of weakness or out of weakness or out of strength. And again, paradox is that it's both. Russian leaders perfectly know huge weaknesses and deficits of their own system and Russian state. But precisely because of that, they're inclined to go for more bold foreign policy, especially, more aggressive policy to compensate these weaknesses. Because there is an image, which I believe they really believe in, that eventually what is an essence in this conflict and what is most important is that's the clash of will, political will, not the clash of potentials. So that's not the potential which will decide. It is political will and certain boldness and will to use scarce resources to achieve goals is actually the potentially decisive element in this conflict, of course, in a longer term perspective. And finally, also the question often asked is, or people quarrel, whether this is a defensive policy or offensive policy. And again, my answer is it's both, simultaneously. And there is complete blurring lines between defensive and offensive. And the offensive policy is part of defensive policy, and defensive policy is part of offensive policy. So they are mutually reinforcing, actually, policies. So that's about the paradoxes of Russian policies, just as an example. And finally, about the solutions. I don't know. I think I already overpassed my time. Basically, I traditionally refer to the three kind of direction of policies. One direction is to keep pressure on Russia as a state, but engage Russians as much as possible. The second is to offer support for Ukraine and other neighbors, but especially Ukraine because it's crucial. Because, as already has been said here today, it's very important to repeat, that Ukraine, for many reasons, is a key to the fates of the region, but also key to the fates of Russia, and by that, key to the fates of the Russian-Western relations. If Ukraine will succeed in its enormously difficult task to reform and create a European transformation based on EU norms and standards, due to its size, potential, proximity, and close links to Russia, it will make extremely difficult, actually, it will undermine the important source of legitimacy of Putin's regime. If Ukraine fails in that endeavor, it will increase the chances of Russia not changing in any time soon. And without regime change in Russia, I would like to stress that I'm pretty convinced of that, without the regime change in Russia, there will be no prospects of any kind of viable cooperation and stability in Europe and in broader also terms. Thank you.
Merrick, thank you. That was a great way of shaping the 3 Ps. But my thanks to all 3 for giving us a great deal of food for thought. What I'd like to do with the time we have is I'm going to ask the panelists a few questions, and then we'll turn again to our audience to ask some tough questions. Uli, I'm going to actually go back to your original presentation, and I have to say, the questions I'm going to ask you are the questions that I wrestle with every day. So I hope you can provide me with answers that I'm searching for myself in my own research. So this question of this is not ideological. It is not communism versus capitalism. But I have to say, I continue to be convinced this is very ideological because it's liberal versus illiberal. And this gets, Uli, to your perfect point about this is really about eroding and diminishing the credibility of the West and our democracy and our economy, as flawed as our democracies and our economies are. And so I actually think we need to start thinking of this as ideological in some ways. And I would welcome your thoughts on that. And while I'm playing devil's advocate, you mentioned that Russia has no soft power. I'm going to push back on that. I think they do. I think it has come in the guise of Russia's compatriot policy, which was very much focused on the ethnic Russian communities that found themselves outside the borders of the Russian Federation after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is a pretty decent soft power package. It's well funded. Ruski Mir, it's cultural, it's very soft, it's language. Who doesn't like the culture, the music, the language, but it's also funding NGOs that are falsifying historic narratives. It is also channeling funds into political parties that do not support a Western approach. So I'd wondered if we sort of should rethink that there is some attraction, in fact, the far left and the far right, what I call the antis. If they're anti-EU, anti-American, anti-global, sort of modern, they are finding attraction in Mr. Putin's vision of leadership and control of the economy. In fact, he's attracting current leaders of NATO countries, in fact, to that illiberal model. My second question, again, this is to all 3 of you. I think what I would have loved George Kennan's thoughts, exactly to your point, on globalization and integration. Because what's been so brilliant to me over the last 25 years is the West has attempted to integrate Russia into our economic systems, whether that's the WTO, G8. As flawed, again, as the Western approaches have been or may be, we tried to do that integration. And what we find in Europe today is an extraordinary amount of Russian economic influences and businesses working in Europe. And there's a positive message to that. But there's also a very negative message, and actually what I consider negative influence, where these business relations feed, control financial sectors. We know the strong dominance in the energy sector. We know now in the media sectors where Russian companies are purchasing media outlets and then are able to control content, that we actually, the globalization impact of this actually, I think, gives Russia influence, particularly in Europe and to some extent here in the US, that we do not understand as part of their policy approach. And I may be wrong in that assessment, but I would welcome your thoughts, and I'm going to shush and let you guys respond. Uli, why don't we'll go down the line and let you have a few thoughts on those questions.
Yeah, thank you. Ideological, non-ideological. I don't see a coherent ideology. What I see is Russia trying to undermine liberal democracy, but the illiberal democracy is full of contradictions that is present. I mean, it's not saying we're in favor of autocracy. It's in favor of, in Syria, people should decide about their government and not the Americans. So it's always in mind with the Americans. America, as Bob Kagan has said, the dangerous nation, because it embodies the principles of liberal democracies and seen by Russia as really the opponent, while Europe is the battlefield. And there's a sense, I think, on the Russian side that Europe can be won over, like they had Putin in 2003 with Schröder and Chirac. He felt that he already had them in his bag. One of them he had, later on at least. So now we have Nord Stream 2. I don't think it's, I mean, if you look at what kind of message Russia has today, it's unclear to me. I mean, if it's about gay rights or LGBT rights, this is really what the right doesn't like. But then again, the strongest anti-American constituency is on the left. So if you are against rights for gays, and then you want to attract the left, no, it has clear limits. I think Russia is moving more on the right with Le Pen financing, so on and so on. But this undermines the message in other constituencies, for example, in Spain, where you have a strong identification with LGBT rights, and where Russia has lost a lot of attraction because of these issues. So I don't see that there is a kind of ideological building, coherence, alternative model. And some years ago we talked about the Chinese model. I think this has also evaporated, and I don't see even anything similar in terms of intellectual construct. So it's I would say it's rather trying what they try to do. I mean, one big project is moving Germany away from the U.S. I mean, break this transatlantic relationship which today is mostly about Washington and Berlin, and so everything that has to do with snooping, with Snowden, is very much, I mean, in favor of this Russian project. But it's rather an operation. It's not an open ideological challenge. And when we read Kennan, we have capitalism and communism. And today there's a liberal world order and people all over the world who want to join because they want to have a decent government. They don't like corruption, as we saw in Ukraine, as we saw in Georgia, as we saw also in the Arab Spring. And I mean, I'm always asking people who know more about Russia than me, is Putin really believing into that the West is really behind that? And most of them tell me yes. I mean, this seems to be the one major, how to say it, the major weakness of his analysis of the West is that he seems to really believe that we are behind, and he's just fighting back against that. Corruption, Russian influence. Again, I think sanctions have demonstrated that the influence of business is rather limited. We've just been with the Transatlantic Academy in Rome, and also have talked to business people and government, and they said European unity is much more important than our business contacts with Russia. And we saw the same in Germany, which we spoke to BDI, a big business organization. They said, we're behind the sanctions policy. So I think it's very limited, but I think it's rather the battlefield is rather the neighborhood. It's about and why was Russia able to start all this in Ukraine? Because there was no clear policy on the European side. It was a weak policy. It was not really supported by the big countries such as Germany and France, the whole neighborhood policy. So whenever we are unclear about what we want, but it's not, the point I want to make, it's not so much about, I think in our Western countries we can, also on propaganda, ultimately, free media is the main corrective against Russian propaganda, and I think it works. But in the neighborhood, is a different story.
So, is it liberalism versus illiberalism? I guess I have a really hard time seeing the United States as credible right now, being on the vanguards of liberalism. The countries of the European Union have a better case to make for it, but the United States has always had a very difficult relationship in its foreign policy between belief in human rights and that agenda and more and agendas that would perfectly happily throw all of that under a bus for various strategic goals, with the result being, and this isn't surprising or, but the result is that it gets pursued when there's nothing to lose, and it doesn't get pursued when there's a lot to lose. It gets pursued when it's in perfect alignment with the strategic interests. It doesn't get pursued when it's not. So, since we're not the poster children for that kind of liberalism, I don't want to claim that that's where we stand. And since a lot of Russia's beef is with the United States, it's hard for me to cast it that way. I do think, if the Europeans wanted to take that on, they'd have a better case. The compatriot stuff, I speak Russian as my first language. I like Russian literature. It doesn't make me like Vladimir Putin. It's not as though a nice, solid Western education with good critical thinking skills doesn't enable you to overcome any amount of Pushkin and Dostoevsky. So I don't know. I don't see that working. What I see working is sort of these planting of seeds of doubt here and there sometimes. What I see working is looking to use the weaknesses of our systems against us, of trying to drive divides between us. I think that has more of a chance, though again, we're holding firm. I mean, I think that's, this was, Kennan's characterization of the Soviet Union as seeing the West as going to turn on each other at any moment is reflected in Putin's hope that he can get the West to turn on each other at any moment. And neither then nor now has there been much of a sign of people turning on each other. There's blips, there's disagreements. But you know what, that's good, right? That's discourse, that's debate, that's what we're supposed to be, that is liberalism. So we don't have to all be in lockstep to all be united. We do all have to be united. Globalization and integration, I mean, obviously interdependence works both ways, but the nice thing about interdependence working both ways is it's actually all ways, right? It's a web. It's a lot of countries. And Russia is far from the strongest of them. So yeah, there are countries that have a lot of money that they'd like to make in Russia, but they can make money elsewhere too. There are very few that are so dependent, and there are very few that are really dependent on their business in Russia, and on the other hand, their governments are so terribly dependent on them to keep the economies growing that they're going to undermine the whole thing. And again, I think, the success of the sanctions regime to now, it's not that it's painless, right? It's that people are willing to take the hit. And that speaks to the fact that, yes, it's interdependent, but I'm all for making Russia a little more dependent on us over time than the reverse. So I'll stop there.
I think that's very crucial, especially as questions about ideology. It's difficult to solve. Well, I would stress that we have now still in Russia a so-called conservative project. And I specifically use the word project because I highly doubt, well, it's difficult to judge, but I highly doubt the people who run them really believes in this. They are rather extremely cynical. So the project has been clearly implemented since early 2012, and it began as a defensive project, internal defensive project. So the original aim of the project was to alienate the liberal protesters, those who were actually protesting on the streets, though of rather liberal, mostly liberal-minded persons, to suggest that these people are simply alien to the true Russians. They are cosmopolites, they are liberal cosmopolites who have lost their Russianness, who actually does not represent Russia. They are alien to the Russian true culture, true Russianness. And so that was created intentionally to create not only huge division, but asymmetric division between a small minority and a huge majority of this conservative, naturally conservative Russians, which was, of course, a bullshit, because it's difficult to be, to build on conservative traditional values in a society where church attendance regularly is about 7%, and which is the world leader in abortions and divorces. So, it's not conservative society, and you cannot actually build a genuine such conservative project with such kind of society. And even more, the people who really like Putin himself, quoting Ilyin or some other past conservative thinkers, sometimes they're really funny. You should watch the small clip when the President Putin, or maybe the Prime Minister Putin then, with Medvedev attends church on service. And he just, the leader of conservative leader, Putin, true representative of Russian traditional values, he just, making a cross sign, and he just, actually mocking this because he doesn't know how to properly do that, and he's laughing. So that's a true face of Putin's conservatism, I think. That's a small representation and an example of that. But strangely enough, from this defensive project, the conservative project became offensive international project. So there was this strange, absolutely weird idea promoted by the Russian-controlled media outlets that Vladimir Putin is a leader of European conservatism. And it was clear reaching out to various conservative circles around in Europe, in the US also, made. It is true that there were some responses, some positive responses, and there is, I think, still the background on that, giving the certain crisis also in Europe about the ideas and identities and so on. But fortunately for us, actually the worst enemy of Russia is Russia itself. And what actually Russia has tried to build, and especially in terms of propaganda and PR, it's perfectly damaged by the very deeds of Russia, by the Russian policies. So actually what Russia did with Ukraine and other issues, very aggressive policies towards Europe and the US, actually hugely damaged those initial attempts to create this kind of attraction from the Russian side. That's my initial kind of assessment of that. I don't know how it will develop in the future. Well, there could be a problem definitely here. And just very briefly, of course, corruption is one of the most important Russian export commodities. Not the oil and gas, corruption. That's the real thing. I mean, this is dangerous. We should not underestimate the threats here. And actually, my third point, which I missed to state in my first intervention, was that we have to, put a large effort to build resilience with our communities, with our own nation states, with our structures, to build resilience, actually to fight the sources problems, to fight corruption, our own corruption, to fight all our deficits within our societies, within our states, not to help Russians to make avail of them. That's one of the most important of the policy prescriptions, I would say, as to Russia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What I'd like to do, because we are standing between ourselves and our own lunch, I'd like to take a lightning round. I'm going to collect quite a few questions, so panelists, get your pens out. We're going to take these down, and then I'll let each of you take a attempt at them. So I'm going to, for my microphone colleagues, I'm going to take a big sweep and go in this direction. So let's start over here. Yes, you sir, 2 in the back, and then we have Professor up front. Oh, and please identify yourself and your affiliation.
Yes, sir. My name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator. And I'm giving, my question is in the perspective of what is known in India and Pakistan, like in third world country, that Putin is not really a corrupt person. He just like to be a leader against the United States. And once it's come to corruption, you know, Musharraf, General Musharraf, he was born and raised up in a 500-yard dwelling in India. And now he is living in a 500 canal state farm. Is Putin as corrupt as General Musharraf? Or any Pakistani 10%, you know, Mr. 10%. He was just an ordinary guy, you know, and how he has so many accounts abroad, and they are ripping poor countries so hard. So is Putin that cruel and brutal with his own people? Thanks.
So my name is Mikhail, I'm from Russia, actually representing Russian society. That part which is not for, which is not against, just investigating what's going on and what should be done. And my question is, so you said without changing the regime, it's not possible to move. But how are you going to do that without us? I mean, maybe we will change the regime ourselves somehow, and preferably with evolution. I don't want any more revolutions in my country, sorry. And what is the positive agenda? Because, here in this audience, for many hours I heard only negative about Russia. I'm a businessman myself, I'm free from the government, and I want positive changes in my country. And what I've heard today is only negative, so we're enemies, so old-fashioned schemes, a lot of stereotyping. And my perception is we need to look forward. If now we're all of you were looking in the past, but if we look in the past, if we look back, we move forward, looking with our backs and asses. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Andrzej Nowak. I would like to go back to the problem of ideology in contemporary offer of Putin's regime. Dr. Speck suggested that there is not anymore any ideology as it used to be in communist times. With that, I agree that it is not the same as it used to be in the communist times. Now it is postmodern, multiple, and very cynical. And this makes a difference because in old-fashioned communist ideology, many people believed because it was not cynical, it was treated as not cynical at least, and it was coherent relatively. Now it is postmodern because it's after a decade or more of real postmodern revolution in Russian political elites. They are not the same elites as formed the Soviet Union or Brezhnev times, that they are elite formed by the 90s, by the postmodern, so to speak, perspective on looking on truth, multiple truths, and so on and so forth. So I agree completely that there are different ideologies addressed to different audiences. Leftist audience, anti-Americanism, always working, still working. This conservative, or I should say rather reactionary audience in Europe. And I think there is not a big problem in contradicting between the two. I don't think that this will diminish their impact because the Western world is also postmodern. So a reactionary audience is not giving a big fuss about I would say, anti-American address of Putin's policy. So I think there are many, not just these two, there are many others. So going to a specific question, one of these possible ideologies is that Russia delivers freedom. Russia liberalizes, for example, Western conservatives from the yoke of political correctness, or liberalizes the world from American hegemonia. But sometimes Russia delivers, so to speak, liberalization to minorities in old-fashioned term, that is ethnic minorities, not just around Russia. But I would like to ask a question. What do you think about the impact or uses of Russia of this kind of ideology, if it is ideology, to help separatisms in Europe? Scotland, Catalonia, Lega Nord, for example. In all these directions, there are influences of Russia. And this is just one of examples of these many multiple, I would say, positive messages, because Dr. Oliker said that there is no positive message. There are many positive messages. There is not one positive message, but there are many positive messages you can separate. Americans can separate themselves from the world, to be isolationist again. And this is audience to which Putin also addresses one of his ideologies. Germany could separate from America. That is another positive message for Germans. So I'm asking about one specific message: separatism in Europe and Russia.
And again, colleagues, if we can just keep these really short so we can get our panelists to respond. So please ask for your indulgence.
This might have been a better question for the last panel, but...
Please identify yourself.
I'm sorry, I'm Doug Samuelson. I run a little consulting company here in town. Nobody's talked much yet about the ethnic component and ethnic conflict component of what's going on within Russia and around the world. And certainly one of the differences now from the 1930s is you don't have the government in Moscow having to worry about how do you keep the Kazakhs and the Belarusians and the Ukrainians in the country. That's good and bad. You don't have the multi-ethnic conflict within the country, but you also don't have all those resources within the country. And in the same way, the legal system is evolving. Under communism, there was this very clear idea we're all under one law and everybody has to be behaving pretty much the same way for this to work. Now it's a lot looser, not as loose as it was in the 1990s when we told them all about free market economics and forgot to tell them that that happens within a structure of law or you get a thugocracy. So can you talk a little more about ethnic conflicts and the legal system and how they relate?
Okay, thank you. Victoria Feinberg again. I have a quick question, which may be difficult though. Do you think that given the Russian tactical flexibility, they're now trying to take advantage of the migrant crisis in Europe? And is it possible that some of the actions in Syria have the secondary purpose to facilitate the migration crisis?
Yes, good afternoon. I'm retired Brigadier General Peter Zwack. I was the U.S. Defense Attaché to Moscow until after the shoot-down of Air Malaysia in 2014. I have a hard power question that I believe is laced with soft power implications. And very simply, from your perspective and your insight and the excellent points both from your panel and the panel before, how would you condense all of those into explaining, if you will, from your perspectives, the Russian, I would submit, highly risky, if you will, intervention into Syria? And do you see, in which they have now, I think, committed prestige, certainly reputation, treasure, and how do you see this thing potentially playing out, and could there be a good end to it?
Well, Hitler, since you raised the question, what George Kennan would say today. My first comment is that it will be definitely not a long telegram, because we are entered into the age of the Twitter, and it has to be very, very brief.
What would George Kennan have tweeted? Okay.
Having said that, I would like to say that in 3 sentences. The first, it seems to me that we are discussing Russia, but we are in fact discussing Russia in the context. And the context is that we are not in the period of the conflicts between the states. The crises are within the states, all the crises. In Russia, in Ukraine, in Europe, in many other states, not saying about Syria and others. In other words, the wars are generated within the states, and this is point number 1. In case of Russia, I would say this is my second point, is that the Russia's concept of modernization and reform collapsed for many reasons. I'm not going out here to discuss it. And the decision was taken to find the solution of an external nature, to present, I would say, the external world as being responsible for that. The United States is blamed for all the possible mistakes which were taken in Russia, but responsibility was of others. So, and the question which was raised, and very, in my view, very justified question, what is the constructive proposal? I would like to say that the future of Russia is up to the Russians. It is not possible even to find, I would say, somebody who will tell Russians what has to be done. It is up to them. And in my view, this is very difficult, I would say, to digest, I would say, that truth, that neither European Union nor the United States or rest of the world is in a position to tell Russians what has to be done. In my view, this cognitive dissonance has to be the subject of the overcoming within Russia. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think we have one here. Kaya's right behind you. Thank you.
John Trop, the Post-Eagle Weekly newspaper. I have a question for Dr. Speck. In your lecture, you mentioned that your assessment overall is favorable of the way the United States and its allies have responded to the war in Ukraine. And you mentioned that on the side of military deterrence, that was satisfactory. I have a hypothetical for you. If the Kremlin shows no progress in implementing the Minsk Accords by the time the Warsaw Summit meets in 2016, do you suppose, by extension, George Kennan would argue for the abrogation of the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997? That is, should, in Kennan's words, countervailing force be used by a forward permanent deployment of substantial NATO assets into Poland and the Baltic states? Thank you.
Okay, I'm looking at the hands here. I see one over there. I just want to make sure. Okay, we have one more question. Thank you.
I will join in the cohort of people looking constructive agenda. There recently was a piece published, by the way, at intersection.eu, finding really fascinating correlations between Russia's ratings of leading politicians, and specifically Vladimir Putin, and the international stage. The situations, so for example, when Russia is perceiving itself as a besieged fortress, his ratings literally shoot through the roof. There was a lot of analysis in recent time about sanctions and their effect, and a lot of people think that we need more sanctions and so on and so forth. As for me, I've been to a lot of protests in 2011, 12, 13, and what I have observed in Russia is that after the sanctions, the public opinion completely shifted away from democratic change. So the West has actually done a tremendous disservice for Russia's democratic movement, because it now is associated with representing some foreign interests in Russia. My question is, what are the ways, in your opinion, to help Russia without actually hurting Russians?
Great. Well, that is a collection of very fascinating questions. I'll let each panelist, here's my bargain. You can choose the questions you'd like to respond to, and we will take the conversation over the lunch break for further follow-up. But very much so, would like each panelist to offer a thought on a positive agenda item moving forward. I think we should always end on a positive note. So if it's okay, do you want a reverse order? Poor Merrick, do you want to start, and we'll work up the line?
Okay, it's a difficult choice. So many great questions. Very briefly, I would try. About the corruption, well, I would refer maybe to Karen Dawish's book, Putin's Kleptocracy, as a kind of possible reading about the problem. Definitely what is corruption in Russia is a highly systemic. That's a kind of social moderating force, but it's also the huge part of one of the foundations of Putin's system. The corruption is increasingly centralized. That is kind of phenomenon we are now observing due to economic crisis. But I will not develop. Corruption is obviously a problem everywhere, and it's a global problem. It's not only Russia. But maybe Russia is specific in a way that corruption in Russia really endangers the economy, really. That's endangers also the effectiveness of the state system, which creates enormous problems. Regime change. That's very important. I would like to stress that there is no way, actually, there is no good future for Russia and Russian-Western relations without regime change in Russia. But it would be a huge mistake if the West would try to engage actively in an attempt to create a regime change exactly like Putin and his colleagues believe that we are doing, which is basically not true. It would be a disaster. I mean, I think the West has no instruments, and that would be absolutely counterproductive. It would produce the exactly opposite effect. So it's extremely dangerous. It would be to engage in such an action. Regime change came only within Russia itself, only by the Russians, only the ways they will choose for that, or they will be allowed for that. I don't know. I mean, we cannot interfere in that. What we should do, however, and that's the second part, and another question about the positive element, engage the Russian society. I mean, we should strongly differentiate within these group of people who hold power and the Russian society, which we should be engaging as much as possible. So as much contacts, as much cooperation, dialogue, human-to-human contacts, joint projects on low level, whether scientific, cultural dialogue, also reaching out to the growing diaspora. Unfortunately, there is a growing Russian diaspora globally, in Europe, in US. Actually, one of the best people of Russia, unfortunately, leaving the country. But these people actually are alternative elites to some extent. And I think we should also reach to these people to help them also create, for example, platforms for discussions, for research projects, for media projects, and so on and so on. To create alternative platforms when in Russia they cease to exist, alternative platform for real debates among Russians themselves also about their country, about their future, about their problems. I think that is kind of indirect way we should and could assist the Russian society, but not with kind of crude ways of trying to impose anything or to, you know, to create such, you know, special operations like that. Oh my God, Syria. It's multi-layer. It's multi-layer. It's very. There's no one single reason. There are many reasons, and there are many mutually reinforcing reasons. Originally, I think that's my strong point. In 2011-12, it was about defending Russia. It was not about Syria. It was defending Russia because there was a clear image that Syria is just another element of the domino of the US geopolitical advance. So they started with Tunisia and Egypt, then there was Syria, then Iran, and then Russia. And actually, people can be quoted saying that Russia will be some over the line this over Syria. So that was kind of a self-defense, and it was also challenging, and it's still very important, challenging the US hegemony, US dominance, and proving especially that US policy is not only wrong, but it's doomed to fail, that the Syria should bury it forever the US regime change policy across the world. And Russians not necessarily want to win this war, because I think it's not possible, but they want the US to lose and to force the US to change this approach to the policy. So not the regime change, but engage Russia as an indispensable partner and indispensable important key player, which has to sit within the table and negotiate the solution. So it's also about the process. It's all about the position of Russia. Well, the Russian propaganda also is very important internally. Russian propaganda, it's absolutely mad about the idea Russia is returning as a global player. That's the theme about Syria. Russia has returned, has proved that it is the global player. So that is also internally very important. Also, to some extent, to cover up failure on Ukraine, so the destruction. So there are many, many different reasons who are actually mutually reinforcing. That's my very short and oversimplified answer.
So actually, I thought that was great. I pretty much agree with absolutely everything. So I'm going to try to see if there's anything that was asked that wasn't already answered that I can add to. I mean, the one piece here, Russian support for separatist movements here and there. It's this fantastic dichotomy, right? That on the one hand, they're in Syria to defend sovereignty, to defend a state's right, to define its borders, to define what it does. That other countries do not get to interfere with another country, full stop. On the other hand, self-determination for some, but not all, right? And I mean, I think that's, it's purely opportunistic. It's what they care about Scotland. They don't care about Scotland. It is about this agenda of driving wedges. And it's also doomed to have remarkably little effect, except in the cases where they actually are invading, and that's post-Soviet, and that's conflicts that have been going on for a very long time, where the self-determination and separatist bit is just a very small component of the overall equation. I mean, I don't know, is it a positive agenda to destroy? Is it a positive agenda to drive wedges? I mean, I would argue it is a positive agenda potentially to challenge where if you think that US policy has over the last decade and a half been harmful, you could argue there's a positive agenda in challenging that. But again, for it to be truly a positive agenda, you need to have an alternative. So what is the alternative? Because Assad's rule is not inherently stable, right? Okay, I agree, there's not a good way back from where we are. It all looks terrible going forward, but it's not as though keeping Assad in was going to have fixed that. So I guess I do come back that even where it might not be all bad, it's still not actually positive because there's no solution there. what about our positive agenda? So again, I agree with everything. I guess I'd add a couple of things. One, and this is, you know, kind of just little nuanced bits. Provide a home for people when they get kicked out, when they can't live in, and not just Russia, in all of these countries. I mean, I think I would like the United States and its allies to be more consistent and to be more credible on human rights. I also think it is incredibly difficult to create democracy abroad. I think, you know, democracy comes to those who want it. So what you can do is protect the Democrats abroad where you can. And that means keeping their cases on the international agenda. It means giving them a place to go if they can't stay in their own countries. And I think in that way, over time, we do support these movements because we present an example of a credible alternative. We're imperfect at it, but I do think it's important to at least try.
Okay, Uli, you have the last word.
Only negative views of Russia. I understand the frustration, but we had 25 years where we really, and my country especially, Germany tried to build a different kind of relationship, and the US did as well. And it turned out that a lot of the assumptions on which this was based were illusions. And we saw Putin coming back, making fun of everybody who believed that he had empowered Medvedev, and then cracking down on protest, and then invading a neighboring country, undermining the European peace order, post-1945, post-1989. There's some kind of frustration. Putin lied openly to all the Western leaders, said, no, I don't have troops in Crimea. And the whole trust is gone. It's zero trust. How can you build a positive agenda if there's no trust? And then the Russians come with their grand bargain idea, you know, in Yalta. Let's divide Europe into spheres of influence. Who are the real players? The US, partly the Germans. So let's sit together with them, the Poles in a certain way, also on Ukraine, and try to make a deal. Well, this is exactly what we don't want. So there cannot be a positive, a positive agenda for them would be if we would agree to that. But even if we would agree on a realist ticket, it wouldn't work because the Ukrainians wouldn't accept that kind of deal. So, Moldova, Georgia is a different case. They're small, but Ukraine is huge. It's big, and it has seen steps forwards in the process of nation building. Then we would have permanent war. This is a recipe for disaster. So I don't think that there is no positive agenda at the moment. So that's why I think we need to accept an antagonistic relationship, which doesn't mean that we try. OSCE, Wolfgang Ischinger, they're trying. And everybody knows there's not much hope, but let's try. And there is cooperation. The EU did with Russia and Ukraine. They have sealed an energy deal which is very clean because it's now transparent. It's organized by the EU, moving out what really has been a cancer of corruption in Ukraine. So yes, we can work with the Russians if they want, and if we want, and then we have interests. It can work with Iran if both sides agree. On Syria, there's disagreement. To me, what Putin wants to prove here is, well, Obama said Assad must go. I said he must stay. Who will win? It's so easy, and it makes sense. And then, of course, it's about autocracy, legitimacy, and pushing back against liberal democracy. But what bigger victory could he score? Syria is very risky. It's the first time Russia is at the mercy of the battlefield. If the Saudis deliver anti-aircraft weapons to the rebels, which they probably won't do because they don't want to endanger their relationship with the US, but this is something that they cannot control. It's not like Ukraine, it's not like Chechnya, it's not like Georgia. So, but also, what is success for them? They don't need to go in and rebuild the country. So they have kind of different measurement for success. So just they can go in and go out and say we tried or whatever. So it's much easier for them, but it's also more risky. Are they intentionally driving the refugee crisis? I think it's a welcome secondary effect, but it's not the main idea, and it doesn't work in that sense. There is no linkage between Syria and Ukraine. I don't see that in Europe. I don't see that in my country, in Germany. And there's trickles down the understanding that the Russians are not there to stabilize the country, which came as a surprise for many. But now I think it's clear what they have a different agenda. So construct. Ideology, I think you put it very well. It's not a coherent ideology, it's messaging. It's trying to win partners or to destabilize the West, but it's very limited, but because it doesn't, they don't have anything, an alternative, something to shape things. Also because there's no economic power. They cannot really go in anymore. To a certain extent, they try in Crimea, but they cannot deliver on anything. Postmodern, yes, but it can only go so far. Minsk and Warsaw, I think they're separate. These are separate tracks. I think NATO is really about ourselves. It's about shoring up the alliance. It's about credibility of Article 5. It has little to do with Ukraine. It has a lot to do with Russia, but Ukraine is a separate process. My expectation is that on Ukraine we'll have an ongoing process because it's very unlikely that Russia will give back the Ukrainian border. So I expect this for years to drag on in some kind of murky thing between frozen conflict and something else. Some of the sanctions will stay in place. We'll have probably a debate, transatlantic debate on sanctions because Congress is unlikely to change, especially if the elections are coming. And the Europeans may have, as always, they have to look for a compromise. So that will be, maybe in 1 year we'll discuss this.
I think that's another conversation that we will have. Well, I will rename this panel, What Would George Kennan's Blog Say, Professor? I would read it as I would read Olia, and Merrick's blog, because this has been a fascinating conversation. But I do have a positive agenda. That would be lunch. So before I let everyone break, let me just give you a few instructions. We'll have lunch, give everyone about a half an hour, but please return very promptly at 2 p.m. because the other positive agenda is we have Professor Walter Russell meet here who will be dynamite and give us some concluding thoughts. But with your applause, please thank our panelists for a great conversation.